What does it take to end a war? And what happens if resolving one fight means picking another, but this time with traditional allies? After 2 months in office, President Donald Trump has ripped up the rulebook on international diplomacy and signalled the end of the post-Cold War security system. Up for debate on Counterpoints with me, Melinda Nucifora. How will a recalibrated US-Russia relationship reshape the world order? For much of the Biden administration, the US prided itself on leading the diplomatic isolation of Moscow.
Russia's Vladimir Putin sought to shake the very foundations of the free world, thinking he could make it bend to his menacing ways. But he badly miscalculated.
Oh, how times have changed. Enter the self-proclaimed ultimate deal-maker, Donald Trump. After more than 1,000 days of war, the White House has gone from viewing Vladimir Putin as a potential war criminal to a trusted counterpart.
I believe he wants peace. I believe that President Putin, when I spoke to him yesterday, I know him very well. Yeah, I think he wants peace. I think he would tell me if he didn't. I'd like to see peace.
Do you trust President Putin?
I believe that, I believe that he would like to see something happen. I trust him on this subject.
The tone in Russia has changed too.
First contacts with the new US administration give certain hopes.
The new administration is rapidly changing all foreign policy configurations. This largely coincides with our vision.
As ceasefire talks continue, the refrain, "Nothing about Ukraine without Ukraine," echoes time and time again. But as US backing appears to waver, it's uncertain if Europe is united or strong enough to fill that void. We'll ask our expert panel how historically significant this apparent realignment is. If Donald Trump's move away from Europe is the beginning of the end of the NATO alliance, and if this rapprochement is, in part, a way to split Russia and China. Stay with us, it's all coming up on Counterpoints. Well, to debate just how important the US-Russian relationship is in terms of the Ukraine war and, of course, beyond, I'm joined by Russian strategist Sergei Karaganov, and also joining us, renowned American political scientist and international relations scholar from the University of Chicago, Professor John Mearsheimer. Gentlemen, thanks for being here with us on Counterpoints. I want to begin our debate on the remarkable shift we've seen in the relationship between the US and Russia since Donald Trump took office. In just 2 months, the US president has seemingly upended traditional allies, publicly pressured Ukraine, and opened the door to friendlier relations with Russia. So, Professor Mearsheimer, let me ask you, is this a historic moment in this realignment, or is this just the fleeting whim of an unpredictable US president?
Well, Donald Trump certainly is unpredictable in lots of ways, but I think this is, to use your language, a historical moment. I think there's no question that Trump has completely abandoned Joe Biden's policies on Ukraine and on Russia, and has adopted a policy or a set of policies that are the exact opposite. What he wants to do, first of all, is significantly improve relations between the United States and Russia. He wants the United States and Russia to have a rapprochement, to have friendly relations again. And this is the exact opposite of Biden. And furthermore, I think that Trump understands that the United States and the West more generally and Ukraine have lost in the war over Ukraine, and that it's time to cut a deal because there's no way the Americans can rescue the situation. What exactly a Russian victory looks like is hard to say, but I think that Trump and his principal advisors understand that the Russians are going to win, and it's better to cut a deal now rather than later. So the end result is you have this fundamentally different policy at play that I'm sure makes Sergei and the Russians happy, but makes the Europeans and many Americans very unhappy.
Sergei, what do you think about that?
Well, I'm not that happy as John assumes, because we could be stopped on our road to total victory over Europe and Ukraine. The fight is it used to be between us and the West. On the territory of Ukraine, Ukrainians were used as cannon fodder. President Trump, to the extent I understand him, is cutting losses. I agree with Professor Mearsheimer, with John. But President Biden, even before, started to withdraw. At first, 2 years ago, or 2.5 years ago, they were proclaiming a name of total victory over Russia. And then when they started to understand about a year and a half ago that they will not get a total victory, they will get either a total defeat and an Afghanistan-like fiasco or a nuclear war in Europe. At some point, some of the Biden officials even bluffed to the extent that if Russia uses nuclear weapons, which we do not want to use, there would be a total annihilation of Russian army by non-conventional forces. So then we send a signal that there will be a counter-strike on American bases. After that, they started to withdraw even before.
That's interesting, though, because I read an article.
They were still willing to continue, and even at the end of the Biden administration, they tried to provoke both Putin and Trump into another round, but both, I think, understood that they are not getting into that trap.
Do you think, though, that this is a historic moment for US-Russia relations, or did you always think this time would come?
Not yet, but it could be a turning point.
What would it take for it to get to that point?
It is a turning point, but we know also the correlation of forces within the United States, and we know that Trump is up to very strong opposition within American elite. He has to survive politically and physically, and also he could change his mind. But however, he is really willing to make America great again, and for that, he has to withdraw from the war which America has been losing.
John, let me put that to you then. If Trump needs to withdraw from the war, he has been saying, as ceasefire talks are ongoing, that he can force through a peace deal. He doesn't seem to think that it's beyond the realm of possibilities that he can get this deal done. Do you think that Donald Trump specifically and the US has leverage over Russia?
No, I don't think the United States has much leverage at all. In fact, I think it has zero leverage. And that's why I wouldn't use the word force. I don't think Trump can force a deal. I think that Trump can negotiate a deal with the Russians. And I think that they can work out a deal. It's not 100% guaranteed, as Sergei was saying, but I think they can work out a deal that would end the war if the Ukrainians and the Europeans agreed. So getting the Russians and the Americans to agree is just the first step. And in a way, that's the easy step. The more difficult step will be getting the Europeans and especially the Ukrainians to agree to the deal. And it's necessary to get everybody in agreement on what the deal is for it to produce lasting peace.
We're absolutely going to turn to Europe shortly, but I want to stay focused on US and Russia first and ask you, Professor Karaganov, the former Putin advisor Sergei Markov told the BBC shortly after those ceasefire talks began between the US and Ukraine in Saudi Arabia, he said that US President Joe Biden was just an enemy. Trump is a rival. How important is that distinction?
We shall see. I'm not commenting on the views of my colleagues. I think that the United States could be a friendly rival, hopefully. If Trump succeeds, the United States will be a strong rival. But it will be run, hopefully, if and when the group which is around Biden, I mean, the more or less realistic group takes over. It will be a predictable rival. It will be a rival with whom one could deal. And it will be, I would say, a potential partner. But the rival will be there, obviously, and we do not think that, I mean, we could get into detente. All the more that the previous detente, full detente, was a total failure in the end.
John, what do you think? Can Russia and the US be friendly rivals? Can there be some form of a partnership?
I think they can be friendly rivals. My view of international politics is that all great powers are rivals with each other. The question is, how intense is the rivalry? And the fact is that the United States is much more concerned about China than it is about Russia. And it has a deep-seated interest in treating Russia as a friendly rival. So I think you can get a friendly rivalry. But I would add two caveats to that. First is there is a huge amount of Russophobia in the West, including the United States, that will be hard to overcome. One cannot overestimate how much Russophobia there is independent of Trump. The second point is, I don't think the Russians can trust the United States after all that's happened since the Cold War ended. I think the United States has been remarkably aggressive towards Russia. It has been dishonest on a number of important issues like NATO expansion. And the end result is it's quite clear that Putin doesn't trust the West at all. And I don't blame Putin. It's not politically correct to say this in the West, but I think it is accurate. So you're going to have a high level of distrust from the Russian side and a lot of Russophobia from the American side. And the end result is it's going to take some work to have a friendly rivalry.
I also want to ask you, Professor Mearsheimer, so much of America's foreign policy has been shaped by this unseen moral and ethical imperative to be the upstanding country, to be on this side of Europe over all others. Are those days over?
To some extent they are, but I think that during the unipolar moment when the United States was the only great power on the planet, we were able to pursue a liberal foreign policy where we tried to shove our liberal values down the throats of other countries. The United States, during the unipolar moment, basically became a crusader state, and we were trying to spread liberalism all over the planet. It did not work out very well. We created a huge number of disasters. We got involved in the forever wars. And then more importantly, great power politics came back when Putin resurrected Russian power and Russia once again became a great power. And when China, which continued to grow economically in the 1990s and early 2000s, also became a great power. So great power politics are now back on the table. And when great power politics are back in an important way, that means that liberal values are not going to matter very much in American foreign policy. So I think the liberal side of the American foreign policy agenda has been badly weakened.
Before we move on to Europe, Professor Karaganov, I want to circle back to something that Professor Mearsheimer said earlier, and that is he doesn't know what victory in Ukraine looks like. In an interview that you yourself did with New Statesman not too long ago, you said, I don't think that even if we conquered all of Ukraine and all the military forces of Ukraine surrendered, it would be a victory, because then we would be left with the burden of a devastated country. So what does Russia want? What does victory in Ukraine look like?
Crushing the will or the moral spine of Europe, of Europeans, who are driving for the third time in the last 100 years plus the world towards a third world war. They are desperate, they're insane, and we have, they are the real threat. We do not want to take all of Ukraine back, God forbid. It has been a burden on Soviet shoulders, the biggest burden in terms of volumes of subsidies. No, thank you. Also, but I think we shall reunite with proper Russian provinces, and then we would like to have, totally demilitarized and neutralize buffer zone out of what is left of Ukraine. But the problem is not Ukraine. The problem is that European elites which anyway are moving towards Europe, as I understand, which are desperate, which have lost everything which they have stood for, are driving their countries towards a big war. What is happening in Europe is unbelievable. It is worse than the period not only prior to 1914, the First World War. It is worse than the period prior to Second World War. I am also a historian, of course, not of the same quality of Professor Mearsheimer, but I know history. The anti-Russian hysteria there is worse than in Hitler's Germany.
All right, you referenced Europe, so let's move on to that. This foreign policy shift that we've seen from the US seems to have caught Europe off guard, and it's left it slightly exposed, to say the least. Only now is the bloc seriously convening summits and meetings about defence and security options, some 3 years into the conflict. Numerous EU officials have spoken about a European nuclear umbrella to deter Russia. Now, I know that is a question we're going to get you on, Sergei, in a moment. But first of all, Professor Mearsheimer, let me ask you, Europe appears to be coming to terms with the fact that it may have to go it alone. Is the US effectively heralding the end of the NATO alliance?
Well, let me just say that I'm uncomfortable talking about Europe like it's a single country. Europe is a collection of countries. And one of the principal reasons that European elites have been able to agree so much in the past, and one of the reasons that people are able to talk about Europe like it's a unified country, is because the United States has been present in Europe and it has kept the peace. I refer to it, and others do, as the American pacifier. And that mainly comes in the form of NATO. But what's happening now is that Trump has made it clear that he has contempt for the Europeans, he has little use for NATO, and he at least wants to greatly reduce the American presence in Europe, if not eliminate it. I'm not saying that will happen, but there's no question that the United States presence in Europe is going to decrease, and Trump is going to turn more responsibility for running Europe over to the Europeans. And what you're going to see happen here is that the Europeans are going to fight with each other. You're going to see that separate countries have separate interests, and they no longer have the United States to solve the collective action problems. So I think that Europe, these European countries, are not going to be much of a problem for the Russians moving forward. There'll be something of a problem, but the fact that they will not be able to coordinate like they have in the past will greatly reduce their effectiveness at causing trouble for Russia. And furthermore, I think, to get to the specifics of your question, I think NATO is in real trouble. And whether it disappears or not, it will never be the same alliance that it has been up to now.
Europe, you are obviously correct. It's a collective of about, 27 odd countries, but they seem to be speaking with more of one voice these days than perhaps they have in the past. Is it not the case that perhaps with the US abandoning its traditional alliances, it's forcing Europe to become stronger together?
I'd just say very quickly, no, the exact opposite. You're going to have huge collective action problems, right? And the United States solved those collective action problems in large part. And the second point I would make, and I would be curious to know what Sergei thinks about this. I do not think Russia is a serious threat to overrun all of Ukraine, much less overrun all of Europe. And I think most Europeans, at least most people in the public, understand that Russia is not a great threat. So you don't have an external threat that can hold the Europeans together, that can solve the centrifugal force problem. So I think if you take away the Americans and you don't have a serious Russian threat to Europe, the Europeans are going to squabble among themselves.
Sergei, I can tell by your facial expression that you have a retort.
Well, first of all, I mean, I agree with I agree with John, but I will add some points. One
is Russia not a threat?
Well, sorry, we don't need a junkyard like Europe. I mean, one of their officials recently said that Europe is an orchard surrounded by wild jungles. I have a different definition. I was one of the top Europe specialists in Russia several decades ago, and so I know a bit about Europe, and I spend a lot of time. It is not an orchard surrounded by a jungle. It's a junkyard, which is with all kind of vegetation, which is growing on the rich soil of hundreds of millions of people they killed, robbed over the last 5 decades. And now they are struggling to keep their privileged position in the international system. The United States are leaving them, and they are left in the cold. They will be unable, like they have been doing for 500 years, to suck the world GNP in their favor. First,
Russia must be somewhat concerned, though.
If I could, help of the United States.
Russia must be somewhat concerned, though, Professor Karaganov, because you have said in interviews and in your own writings on your website that there should be a change in discussion about nuclear deterrence and that nuclear weapons could be used against parts of Europe to end the war in Ukraine and establish deterrence. So reading into that, doesn't Russia see Europe as a threat if it feels it needs to deter it using nuclear weapons?
I've been writing about nuclear weapons recently. Because I saw that the West, but especially Europe, has deteriorated into a habit of what I called strategic idiocy. They stopped fearing war, nuclear war. And I tried to persuade my government, and I hope I was successful, That it should change our nuclear policies in order to make a nuclear deterrence workable. I hope that has been done, and that our American future partners understood that. Europeans are simply insane. They do not yet understand that. I hope over the next several months or years, they will start to understand that they are looking into an abyss. But at this juncture, they want to prolong the war as long as possible, sending after Ukrainians, after they waste more than 1 million Ukrainians already, they want to send East Central Europeans into the battle. They need this war to save, this elite, which is completely insane and is completely failed. It needs this war to cover up their mistakes, if not worse. They are failures, and they need a war. We hope that we could stop that. Hopefully, with not with the help of the Americans, but if Americans withdraw, I think that those Europeans who are not yet completely insane will understand that they could not rely on, by the way, on extremely weak American nuclear guarantees. I am a historian of nuclear strategy. United States have never since the late 50s was willing to use nuclear weapons in defense of Europe. And of course, they will not. Russians or Soviets actually did not want to attack Europe. Why on earth do we need that? I mean, small peninsula on the tip of Eurasian mass. We are the biggest country, the richest country in terms of resources.
Let me turn it over to John.
When people are talking about Russia invading Europe, I mean, imagine, it's not even laughable. It's disgusting.
Well, I mean, Russia also said it wasn't going to invade Ukraine, and look at where we are. But Professor Mearsheimer, let me ask you, being a great power, as you say Russia is, means leading from the front on the world stage. But considering Trump's America First policy, is that not a show of weakness, in a sense, a sign that the US is not willing or able to be a global leader anymore?
Well, I don't know what it means to be a global leader. I think this is one of these sort of innocuous or amorphous phrases that we use in the West to encourage the United States to be involved all over the planet, interfering in the politics of every country on Earth and fighting unnecessary wars. I mean, this is what we have to do to be a leader. I'm not interested in being the leader. I'm interested in having a smart foreign policy that maximizes American security. And I think picking a fight with Russia over Ukraine that ends up killing huge numbers of Ukrainians and Russians and wrecking the NATO alliance makes no sense at all. And I think what we need is a smarter foreign policy. And I think when it comes to Trump's policy with regard to Russia, he is doing the right thing. The United States should have good relations with Russia, and we should go to great lengths to shut down the war in Ukraine for Ukraine's sake, for Russia's sake, and for our sake. And if you want to call that leadership, then I like leadership. But the way we talk about leadership in the West these days, I really don't like, because it really is all about interfering in the politics of every country on the planet, which gets you into unending trouble.
Both of you, I think, mentioned China in the early parts of our conversation. So let me take the discussion there. Many observers of history, both of yourselves, I would assume, being well-versed in this area, will recall President Richard Nixon visiting Chairman Mao in China after a period where there was no diplomatic relations. That visit yielded huge results. It shifted the balance of power and helped further split the communist bloc and made it clear that perhaps the Soviets couldn't fully rely on its partner. So, first of all, I'm going to ask you, Professor Mearsheimer, do you think this attempt to woo Russia with a deal in Ukraine, with a rapprochement, is an attempt to force a wedge between Beijing and Moscow?
Well, there's two issues at play here. One is the issue you identify, which is that the Russians and the Chinese are now close allies, maybe not formal allies, but de facto allies, because the Americans have pushed them together, and this does not make strategic sense. The second issue, which you didn't mention, is that the United States has a vested interest in pivoting to Asia to contain China, because China is a peer competitor from the American perspective. China is a more important problem for the United States than Russia is. So we want to be able to pivot. And being pinned down in a war in Ukraine makes it very difficult to pivot to Asia. And I would argue that because we have not been paying attention to Asia, our containment policy in East Asia has suffered as a consequence. So I think what the Trump administration wants to do is, number one, it wants to be able to pivot fully to Asia by putting an end to the war in Ukraine. And then number two, as you describe, I think that the United States would like to drive a wedge between between Russia and China. Whether it can do that, given American behavior over the past decades, is questionable. I'm not sure the Russians trust us enough that they break with the Chinese in any meaningful way. But I do think that is an American goal.
Okay, Professor Karaganov, do the Russians trust the US in a meaningful way that you would be willing to break from China? And do you think that this is what Donald Trump is trying to do?
It is not a matter of trust. Even if we trusted the United States, which we did not, we would not abandon our quasi-alliance relations with China. It is a force multiplier for both countries. I mean, our American former partners, now foes, now probably again partner, did a fantastic, among many mistakes. I mean, during last decades, when they pushed two friendly countries, China and Russia, into an alliance. And now we see, I mean, that has been a great help to both of us, first. Second, so we shall not abandon our Chinese friends. However, we do not want to be totally reliant on China, and we need more space, and more space also in terms of good relations or normal relations with the United States. So it is a win-win situation for us, because we shall have a better relations with the United States and a stronger hand in our relations with our Chinese friends. However, they will remain friends because, I mean, we have a common border, we have great trade, our economies are not competitors, obviously, they're natural partners. I mean, we have huge resources, everything which China needs, and they have a lot of labor, which we do not have. So the Trump administration, the first Trump administration, I mean, several years ago, when they came to power, they sent the emissaries to Russia. Some of them came to my office at the time they were still allowed to travel, and were trying to woo us away from China. People like myself told, I mean, no, thank you. I mean, you are unreliable, and these are neighbors and very profitable and useful friends. And now, Trump administration, I think, is more realistic. They understand that they could not woo Russia away, but they want to strengthen their hand vis-a-vis China and give Russia a bit more space, so we would not be totally reliant on China or dependent on China. And that makes sense from my part, geopolitical. I mean, it creates a better balance. However, I question whether it is a wise policy for the United States to see China as a rival. I mean, it should be more a competitor. In the ideal world, I think three countries, Russia, China, and United States, plus possibly India.
What do you think about that, Professor Mearsheimer? Would you put Russia up there alongside the US, China, potentially India? Are they peers?
Yes.
Well, my view is that there are three great powers in the world, the United States, China, and Russia. I would not categorize India as a great power at this point in time, and most people don't. It's a major power for sure, as are Germany and Japan. But the three great powers are the United States, China, and Russia.
So what do you think, Professor Mearsheimer, the US can offer Russia to move it away from China, if that's in fact what they're trying to do? Because China is Russia's largest trading partner, and there is a heavy economic reliance. What can the US do? What can it tempt Russia with?
Well, with good relations. And we can push the Europeans very hard to also have good relations with the Russians. We can put an end to the Ukrainian war. We can reestablish economic intercourse between Russia and the West. We probably can't bring it back to the pre-2022 levels, but we can go a long way in that direction. And I think that will help to improve relations between Russia and the United States. And it might put a tiny wedge between, or let me put it differently, it might put a little daylight between Russia and China. But I think Sergei's views of how the Russians view what the Americans are up to is reflective of how most Russians think. They don't trust the Americans. They're not going to abandon the Chinese. And therefore, there are limits to what the United States can do in terms of getting the Russians to be closer to the United States and less close to China.
Okay, Professor Karaganov, let me ask you this. Ukraine has been asked to make many concessions, including territorial concessions, and this mining deal that was on the table, off the table, maybe it's back on the table again. The big question is, what do you think the Trump administration expects from Russia in return?
I do not know. First of all, I mean, we have a name, and that is to eliminate Ukraine as a spearhead, which is close to Russian hearts, Western spearhead. It will be eliminated. I mean, totally demilitarized, hopefully. That is our aim, first. And second, is, of course, as I've said, is to undermine our Western, especially now European, mostly European neighbors, which made themselves into enemies. So, as I'm saying, we in the end game, we have to crush the moral spine of this Europe. Hope then let them fight each other or be friendly with each other. It doesn't matter. I mean, we are not interested anymore. We have finished our European journey. Thanks God. By the way, it lasted for too long, 130 years more than it was needed. So we are now, with great gusto, saying goodbye. However, of course, we are partially culturally European, and we love, as Dostoevsky said, the holy stones of Europe. I love them too. I have a flat in Venice, which I hope, I will visit before I die.
Can I just ask you what you mean by eliminate Ukraine? That's very strong language. I just want you to explain or maybe elaborate on that. Is that eliminate Ukraine as a country, as a state, eliminate Ukraine as a threat?
No. eliminate as a threat.
Okay.
We do not want to take over all Ukraine. Let it be. I mean, furthermore, it has been a failed state. It has been failed by its elite or non-existent elite from the beginning, and it had been a problem. Unfortunately, Russian government didn't understand what the problem. We didn't pay any attention to what has been happening. Now they also have a Nazi ideology, so we'll have a big problem. But we do not need all of Ukraine. We want to have our pure Russian regions back home. By the way, these areas, which are east and south, has been producing 70% of Ukrainian GDP because they have the best people, the best industry, created by the Soviet Union and by the Russian Empire.
Also, one could argue they have the natural resources. Yes, Professor Mearsheimer, go.
I just wanted to ask Sergei a question. The Russians have annexed 4 oblasts and they've annexed Crimea. And they've demanded that the West and Ukraine recognize those annexations. I'm curious what you think, what additional territory do you think that Russia wants to take in Ukraine to feel secure? In other words, do you think the Russians are going to take Odessa? Do you think they're going to take Kharkiv? I mean, you've said, and I think it's true from my perspective, that the Russians would be crazy to try to conquer all of Ukraine and to incorporate it into Russia. But what exactly do you think is the ideal chunk of territory that the Russians should take from Ukraine to ensure Russia's security?
4 regions and Crimea are the minimum. Then there should be a very wide total demilitarized zone controlled by Chinese, Arabs, or whomever. The better alternative is, of course, to return back our southern Black Sea provinces, which have been part of Russia and culturally, politically, as well as economically. But probably at this juncture, it's better to have simply a huge demilitarized zone, so that we shall not be threatened by the swarms of drones and rockets at the beginning. But I think it will take time before we could finish this war, because at this juncture, Europeans will try to ignite crises one after another. So the best solution is the east of Dnieper and the south. However, it could be costly, both in terms of resurrection of these territories, re-education of the people, and in terms of bodies of our soldiers. I mean, we are trying to save as many soldiers as we possibly could.
What do you make of
we
that
shall
answer,
see.
Professor
It will be a long process.
What do you make of that response?
I think it makes a lot of sense. I mean,
but how do you think the US and Europe would react if Russia is going to take Black Sea regions, part of the south of around the Dnieper River?
Well, it all depends on when the war is settled. If you were to settle the war now, and the Russians just annexed those 4 oblasts plus Crimea, the issue that you're raising would not come up. The problem is, I don't think the war is going to be settled quickly. And although it's very difficult for the Russians to make significant progress quickly on the battlefield, I think there is a reasonable chance that they will be in a military position to conquer areas like Odessa and Kharkiv over the course of 2025. And I think there'll be powerful incentives for the Russians to capture that territory for strategic reasons. And if they do capture that territory, I think the Russians will want to keep it. This is why I think if you're Ukraine or you're the United States or even the Europeans, you have a vested interest in settling this war quickly, because those 4 oblasts in the Far East and Crimea, they're gone. Right. And what you want to do, again, from a Ukrainian point of view, especially, is prevent the loss of more territory. And I think if you think about Putin's hand, the hand that he's playing, he'd rather have more territory than less. He'd rather have Odessa. He'd rather have Kharkiv. Now, the question of how costly that is comes into play. And that's what Sergei was saying. And I fully understand that it might not be worth it in terms of the number of Russian soldiers who will have to die to conquer that territory. But if a lot of Russian soldiers don't have to die, if the Ukrainian army begins to crumble, I think the incentives for the Russians to take more territory is great.
We're almost out of time, but I just want to wrap up with just a broad question. And I'm not sure how optimistic or pessimistic either of you are going to feel about it. Professor Mearsheimer, let me ask you first. Do you think that the world is heading for a very turbulent period? We have a US president who came in saying he was going to be a peacemaker, but we have seen unpredictability, we've seen surge in defence spending in Europe, we see talk about nuclear umbrellas. Are we heading for a bit of a time of global chaos?
Well, I think that there's big trouble ahead. For many decades in the future, we're going to have a very turbulent world. First of all, the US-China competition, which I think will be the most important conflict of the 21st century, is not going away. I think with regard to Europe, even if you solve the Ukraine conflict, there are all sorts of other potential conflicts in Eastern Europe, and there will be a poisonous relationship between Russia and the Europeans, as reflected in Sergei's comments, for a long time coming. And furthermore, you have the Middle East, where the United States supports Israel, which is a rogue state that is attacking virtually all of its neighbors and shows no signs of becoming a peaceful actor in that region. So there's going to be big trouble for as far as the eye can see.
We've got about 1 minute left. Professor Karaganov, what do you think? Are we in for more turbulent times, or is Russia pushing for peace?
Tectonic shifts, tectonic plates have moved under the previous international system. So in for at least for 20 years of instability until the new balance will be settled. During this period, I think we have to rely more on the validity of nuclear deterrence. That's why I'm pushing that issue, because there's no other means at this juncture to prevent a series of conflicts or these conflicts deteriorating into a big war. However, one of these conflicts could be passed by due to changes in the American policy. Though, of course, I'm not very happy with what Trump is doing, because his peace initiative are stopping us on the way to victory over East and Southern Ukraine.
I feel as if we are going to have both of you gentlemen back on Counterpoints, because it doesn't feel like we're at a point of resolution anytime soon, and we really value your analysis here. So thank you for your time. That is all the time we have for in this debate, though. Professor John Mearsheimer from the University of Chicago and Professor Sergei Karaganov, Russian political strategist and advisor. Thank you both for your insight and analysis. And thank you to you at home for joining us here on Counterpoints with me, Melinda Nucifora. Remember to subscribe to Al Arabiya English's YouTube channel and follow us on X and TikTok. Thanks for your company.